I wanted to talk this morning a little bit more about understanding the different kinds of minds, the different parts of minds, and how they all interact with each other, which is a important topic as we start to begin to become more aware of our minds, beginning to identify and track the movements of these different kinds of minds internally. So that's what I wanted to get into a little bit later in the class, but why don't we go ahead and get started with some meditation? The point with meditation, because we're limiting our external engagement, gives us a chance to become more aware of what's happening internally. Part of that is our body, but really we're moving more and more towards becoming aware of our mind and tracking the different movements of mind. So we'll go through this practice together. So as usual, we just make sure that our bodies are comfortable. That will help avoid us having to readjust too much later on in the practice, allow us to stay a bit deeper in the meditation. And as usual, we begin with a deep breath in and out. It's just our reset button. And another breath in and out, and just inviting ourselves to relax. And then another breath, asking ourselves, what is most important right now? By reducing our outer engagement, we can become more aware of things like the feelings in our body and our own breathing. And we can begin to appreciate that it's quite complex, even though it's automatic. It's quite complex. As we breathe in, our body, the air inside our lungs becomes cooler. As we breathe out, our body, the air inside our lungs becomes warmer. Just these very subtle shifts. Even the pH in our blood changes very slightly from inhalation to exhalation. Our entire body is involved. And we are simply becoming a bit more sensitive to this space inside. As we become sensitive to our body, we realize it's changing all the time. It's complex, many parts. They relate to each other. But our awareness of our body is actually part of our mind. The awareness itself is mind. It is our mind becoming aware of these sensations. We tend to think about our mind being inside our body, but really our body is inside our mind. It is our own experience of our body, or others' experience of our body. It is the only body. And just like our body, our mind itself is very complex, many parts, changing all the time. They interrelate with each other, different parts of mind. And just like sometimes the body is more at ease and sometimes less at ease, so sometimes our mind is more at ease, sometimes less at ease. So, for example, if you hear something like these words that I'm speaking that can make you think of something else, which in turn makes you think of something else. Maybe we have reactions. Maybe it calms us down. Just begin to notice what kind of mental activity is happening inside our own mind right now. It can be helpful even just to name those feelings. Peace, distraction, sleepiness, relief, curiosity, irritation. So many different parts of mind can be active, moving, changing. So whereas the breath is a very concrete or relatively concrete object of meditation, watching our own mind is slipperier. The mind moves much more quickly. We change states of mind. We just try to notice what kinds of states of mind are active for us now. There are even different levels of mind. So when we're thinking superficially, our mind tends to be up in our head. But as our mind becomes more peaceful, relaxed, if something moves us deeply, or for example, while we're falling asleep, our mind shifts into our heart. To try to ask ourselves, where does our mind feel like it's located right now? In our head, in our heart, somewhere else? And then from among all of these different thoughts and feelings, we can try to cultivate one in particular, a sense of gratitude, a sense of appreciation. For example, that we are alive right now and have the ability to meditate, to enjoy our human life. Just some feeling of gratitude for our circumstances. can think through our meditation today, through listening, contemplating, building our mental strength. We're building mental pathways. We can develop the intention that these pathways can lead us to maximizing our wisdom, our good heart, our skill. And then we can, with this motivation, we can open our eyes and arise from our meditation. So at the end of the meditation there, and then regularly in these classes, I'll talk about these mental pathways. Mental pathway, like neurological connections in our brain, for example, or habits that we're building up. The term pathway kind of implies that you're going somewhere, and really these pathways are about how we process information or how we act on information that we're encountering. But it's worth asking the question, where are we going with this? What are the mental pathways we're trying to build taking us? We're just taking a walk through the proverbial woods, or are we going on some destination or journey? The particular mental pathways, we can say that every mental pathway does take us on a journey, because it actually changes our world, that the world that we're encountering changes dramatically depending on what mental pathways we're following. So even just with a few words, just saying, we can reflect on being grateful that we have this life, this opportunity to meditate, for example. Even just a few words can change a little bit or a lot our outlook on life, can change our entire perception of the world, can give us some sense that we're a fortunate person instead of an unlucky person. Literally, it is just a belief, either of those. Are you a fortunate person, or are you an unfortunate person? Those things are beliefs, right? And it really depends on what we focus on. And I was reading some analysis the other day of how money contributes to people's happiness, and they were saying that very poor people are generally a lot more unhappy, and they're a lot more vulnerable in general, not always, but a lot more vulnerable to circumstances. If they get sick, it puts a lot of things at risk. There's a lot of vulnerability. And so for example, in the US, getting up to a household income of about $75,000, does correlate to some increase in happiness, just in the sense that there's a less vulnerability. Now, there are very poor people who are perfectly happy, and they've learned how to be that way. But beyond $75,000, there's no correlation. And part of the reason is, I like the analysis that I'd read. Part of the reason is that it takes more once if you have a lot of money, then there's kind of the assumption that you've got to do something fancier to be happy, right? You've got to having a car is not enough. You've got to have a nice car. Having a vacation down, taking a walk in the park is not enough. You've got to go to, fly to Central Park. And so that people actually begin to lose appreciation for all of the small joys and small delights, right? The fact that you have food. It may not be the world's fanciest food, but you have food, right? You can derive basically the same level of satisfaction from just having food as you would from having the world's fanciest food. Anyway, but you can see how these things are just really a shift in perspective, a mental shift, and how important it is for us to keep grounding ourselves with humility in just appreciating our circumstances, because it is a deeply natural, just like inflation is natural in the economy. Taking stuff for granted is totally natural for us. We just, kind of always want the next better thing, something bigger, better. So the mental pathway that we're strengthening with gratitude, for example, is a mental pathway moving towards a fortunate world. If I could say, pop in your car, 40 minutes away, you'll arrive in an incredibly fortunate world. We're like, all right, great. We go to Fortunateville. I don't know what we call that. Good Luckville. But it is like that. We're literally changing our mind and changing the perception of the world as well. What we're doing is we're changing the pathways are leading us to being a different person. They're strengthening certain characteristics, weakening other characteristics. They're predisposing us to, for example, with the practice of giving. There's an old Buddhist expression: "From giving comes wealth." From giving comes wealth. Now, seems superficially a little bit contradictory, right? You give, you have less. But what you're doing when you're practicing giving is, first of all, you're strengthening this tendency to give, but also you're strengthening even your ability to appreciate. I've said this before, but even your ability to appreciate the gifts that you have, what you have, the fact that you have something to give at all. So, but at the heart of all of these mental pathways, we're trying to move to a world in which we are simply at peace, a world, you could say, a world beyond the ordinary. We don't want to live in an ordinary world. Like, do you want to be an ordinary person? Do you want to live in an ordinary world, ordinary place? No, we want to be special, right? Or if we want to be beyond the ordinary, like we want to live in a special place. Right? We're trying to move beyond the ordinary in a sense. And that really is a journey through the mind, that through these mental pathways. And I've cited this quote several times, but from Einstein, either everything is a miracle or nothing is a miracle. If you live in a world where everything's a miracle, you live in a world of wonderment, where everything is beyond the ordinary. And so this is the pathway that we're taking. Now, just like our body has pathways, blood vessels, for conducting blood, airways. Our muscles could be understood as like a pathway for conducting force. But within our mind, there's many pathways as well. And so getting to know, and there's an interplay between our body and mind. So the part of the reason for meditating on the breath and meditating on the body is just to ground us and to kind of give us something relatively more concrete, even though the breath can be subtle, but give us something a bit more concrete to meditate on. But one of my teachers gave the analogy that if you're that if somebody is golfing, right, that you need there to be a flag in the hole when you're at a distance away. If you're at the tee, or when you're at a distance away from the green, there needs to be a flag in the hole so you can see where the hole is that you're trying to get to. But once you get onto the green, you get a little bit closer, you can remove the flag and you're just focusing on that hole. And the analogy here is that the body is like the flag, that we want to focus on our body just to begin to ground our mind. Because like I said, our mind is can move super quickly and move to anything. And not necessarily very grounded, but our body just always stays in the same, just always, it's basically always there. Again, one of my teachers commented that nobody in the history of mankind has ever been so distracted that when they returned their attention, their body was no longer there. The body's it's just always there. Your mind can wander a million miles away, but the body is always sort of with you, as this sort of abiding thing. So it orients you back to the inner world. And so we can focus on our body to begin to ground our attention, to begin to become more, build some of that mental strength, the strength of our attention, the strength of our conscious control of what we're focusing on. But gradually we can move beyond just focusing on the body and focus on the mind itself. And within the mind, the traditional explanation of the mind that I received is that minds can be divided into two categories: main minds and what are called mental factors. And our main minds are just consciousnesses, and they're like our eye consciousness, or ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness, mental consciousness. And if you look at your visual consciousness, right now you can see your whole environment. You can see the computer and me and your room and so forth. So that whole panorama that you're currently perceiving with your eye consciousness, that is what's being perceived by consciousness itself. But just like this panorama has countless little parts, right? Shapes, colors, and so forth. So the mind itself has countless parts. So the mind is not just one thing, it's made of countless parts, like a mosaic. If you look at a mosaic, every one of the little fragments is a separate piece, and corresponding to all of the different facets of your visual awareness is a corresponding mind, which is called a mental factor. A mental factor like in math, you can the component parts that you can divide something up into. So any consciousness can be divided up into a lot of parts. So one way of dividing up consciousness is into, okay, there's the part perceiving this, the part perceiving that, the part perceiving that. But there's other ways of dividing up consciousness, like there are peaceful parts, there are unpeaceful parts, there are parts that are seeing something pleasant, or perceiving something, or experiencing pleasure, experiencing displeasure, etc. And this whole process of breaking down what seems like just one thing and beginning to analyze what it's actually made of is part of what is referred to when people talk about mindfulness. Mindfulness means becoming aware of what's actually there. With a nod to the world of architecture, if you see a building, an untrained eye, a person will just see, oh, there's a building there, right? But a trained eye will begin to see, oh, there's all these different facets. Look at the design, the materials that it's made of, the location, the structure, et cetera, beginning to discern all these facets. And so we want to develop a discerning eye towards our own mind, and beginning to identify these different mental factors with mindfulness. Mindfulness in this context means that, so mindfulness, when we're focusing on the body, is part of it is just remembering to keep the awareness of the body. Mindfulness, how somebody says, you forgot your car keys again. You left the house, you forgot your car keys again. Well, you're not being very mindful, are you? Mindfulness really relates to remembering in part. So mindfulness of the body means remembering to keep focusing on the body, but it also means having this discernment of what specifically is happening within the body. There's some awareness, and there's also a bit of distance. There's a bit of distance between that mind that is being mindful and the body itself. So similarly with mindfulness of the mind as it is called, a little bit of a tongue twister, I guess, mindfulness of the mind, what you're doing is you're remembering to watch the mind. And you're also paying attention to the different aspects of the mind that are coming up. But there's also a sense of distance, that you're not having this strong sense of self. Like, it's not me, it's the mind. So I've touched on this before. I think I'll touch on everything again and again over time. So anyway, hopefully helpful reminder for me, hopefully helpful reminder for you. But the speaking of mindfulness, I think I've forgotten what I was going to say, but there is a huge difference between I am jealous and there is jealousy in my mind, or even there's jealousy in the mind. There's a huge difference, right? If you are jealous, well, good luck. That's just what you like. You're jealous. And that's the way, like, I am a white male. And as much as I want to be an advocate for increased diversity and representation in the tech community, there's a limit to what I can do, because everywhere I show up, it's another white male there. We're trying to get more non-white males in the tech community. Probably fewer Indian males as well, probably. But everywhere I go, there's another white male there. So it's like I'm kind of stuck with that identity. So if you're jealous, right? If you're a jealous person, it becomes part of your identity. It's like you're just stuck. That's why. Oh, I'm angry. I was, I was, I'm a damaged person, something like that. These things, when we bring them very deeply into our identity, you can't get rid of these things, right? Like they're just part of how you see yourself. But there's such a big difference if you think, oh, there's jealousy in my mind. Look at this. If you suspect, here's one tip. If you suspect that there might be some jealousy in your mind, there is. We're normally not very good at, like, really fully honestly acknowledging what's going on in our mind. And there's a strong tendency for us to not want to notice anything unsavory in our mind. I compare it to two magnets of the same pole. If you try to push them together, they don't want to touch, right? So our self and any faults, like, they don't want to touch. Like, we don't really want to acknowledge that there's any faults in our mind or anything unsavory, or, oh, I'm not really angry. I'm just, want to make sure who's boss around here. There's a reluctance to acknowledge in our mind even if we're unpeaceful. Oh, I'm not stressed. That was again, you keep showing up. So I may be reusing some of these analogies over time, but oh well. I went to my dentist 10 years ago in Baltimore, and I had some cold sores in my mouth, and he said, "Oh, do you get these often?" And I said, "Oh, well, if things are really busy at the meditation center, sometimes, I'll get them." And he's like, "Oh, you mean like stress?" And I'm like, well, I don't really like to acknowledge, I don't really like to say that I've got stress, right? I'm a meditation teacher, getting stressed. But we laughed about it. And he said, oh yeah, it's like my wife, the gynecologist, getting accidentally pregnant, which was his actual story. So, none of us are invulnerable to these movements of mind. We all experience stress. We all experience anger, pain, jealousy, these different minds. But there's a huge difference just to notice them and to not worry about it so much, to not feel like it's tainting us, but to really be open even to identifying our faults. So there's a famous one of the most famous stories at least in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, about watching the mind, was a story of a practitioner named Geshe Ben Gongyal. Funny name, Geshe Ben Gongyal, but he was famous for watching his mind. And he was partly famous because his day job before he got into watching his mind was he was a bandit. He was a robber. He was a rough dude. He was a thug. He would, wait. He was a highwayman. He'd sort of wait for caravans, and he would ambush them. And I probably killed people. I don't know what the whole backstory was. Scurrilous character. Anyway, he showed up, 900 years ago, 1100 AD. I don't know how you showed up at a meditation class online or something. I don't know how you bump into those things if you're a bandit in Tibet, but and then decided to change his ways. But he had only one practice, and his practice was just watching his mind. And so I think he became a monk, but he was really kind of lazy or nonconformist compared to all the monks. He wouldn't go to any of the regular, like, scheduled meditations or teachings or whatever. He just sat in his room all day long. So this guy with a questionable background becomes a monk and just doesn't participate in the program, just sits in his room all day long. And everybody's like, what do you do in your room all day long? And he said, I have one practice, which is watching my mind. I just watch my mind. In fact, he had a bag of stones that he would count, bag of black stones and white stones, or dark stones and light stones. And every time he had a beneficial mind, a positive mind, he would put a white stone down there or a light stone down there. Every time he had a disturbed mind, an angry mind, he'd put a dark stone down on the ground. And so at the end of the day, he'd count up those stones and see if he'd made progress. And in the beginning, it was almost all like dark stones. He's like, I don't want to be here. I don't like these people. But over time, over the days and weeks and months of just watching his mind, he started getting to the point where there's more light colored stones, and then gradually got to the point where he would go days without any of these dark colored stones coming up. And so he said, what I do is I watch my mind, and whenever I notice a disturbed mind coming up, I take the spear of the opponent. Remember, he's a rough dude. He's the spear of the opponent, and I plunge them into the head of this disturbed mind. And then they leave me alone in peace, and I just enjoy my peaceful mind. So that was what he did. Just sort of watching his mind, like, what are you doing here? Whoa, get out of it. That's not the only way to approach watching your mind, but it just speaks to the power of this kind of patience and discernment, and also not judging ourselves by them, but having some wish to systematically shift some of our perception. So in the beginning, we're going to still notice the same tendencies. We try to meditate and we get bored or distracted and so forth, but then we bring our attention back, and then we get bored and distracted again. We bring our attention back, but over time, we build up these tendencies to be able to control our attention. And in a similar way, with the kinds of minds we're trying to cultivate, maybe in the beginning, there's a lot of jealousy, but over time, the jealousy lasts for shorter and shorter periods. It goes from lingering for days, weeks, months, to just, maybe for a few hours, to maybe for a few minutes, to the point where at some point we're no longer jealous. We appreciate that other people having good fortune doesn't deprive us of good fortune. There's more than enough good fortune in the world for everybody if we all sort of appreciate and rejoice in our own good fortune. So anyway, that's some thoughts on understanding how the mind has many parts called mental factors, how we can watch those, how they change, move over time, and how we can watch them, and gradually through patience, just not judging ourselves by whatever minds are arising, but gradually cultivating the beneficial ones, and opposing the ones that are less helpful. So I've run down the clock a bit, but why don't we take just a couple minutes to conclude, but I'm happy to discuss afterwards if anyone has questions or thoughts on this. Okay, why don't we just settle in with a couple of breaths just to return our mind to a peaceful state. Then we can think, even just beginning to ask ourselves, what is going on inside my mind? What are the different mental factors that are afoot? It's beneficial in helping us to recognize that there's a gap, a difference between ourself and these minds. And we can just make a decision to cultivate this practice of mindfulness of the mind, trying to watch our own mind, especially when we're on our own, enjoying peaceful minds, challenging, opposing, disturbed minds. And in general, building this inner pathway to an extraordinary world, a world beyond the ordinary, a world of good fortune, created through our own extraordinary cultivation of our mind. Then with this motivation, we can relax our concentration and arise from meditation.